In the annals of human history, few names evoke such visceral revulsion as that of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, better known to posterity as Caligula. What began as Rome's great hope in 37 CE descended into a nightmare that would scar the empire's collective memory for centuries. The young emperor, who once promised renewal and prosperity, transformed into a monster whose depravity knew no bounds, turning the imperial palace into a theater of systematic degradation that would make even the most hardened historian pause in disbelief. The transformation was as sudden as it was complete. Where once stood a beloved prince who reduced taxes and freed political prisoners, there emerged a tyrant who viewed human dignity as nothing more than kindling for his twisted desires. Ancient sources speak in hushed tones of midnight processions where young patricians disappeared into palace chambers, never to emerge unchanged. Suetonius, writing decades later, could barely bring himself to record the full extent of what transpired behind those marble walls. Yet what he did document paints a picture of calculated cruelty that defies comprehension. Rome had seen its share of excess before Caligula. The city that conquered the known world was no stranger to violence or decadence. Yet what set this emperor apart was not merely his personal depravity, but his systematic transformation of state machinery into an instrument of sexual humiliation. Where previous rulers might have indulged their vices in private, Caligula made degradation a public spectacle, forcing the Senate itself to bear witness to acts that violated every sacred boundary of Roman society. The historical record presents us with a paradox. How could a civilization that prided itself on law and order produce such unbridled chaos? How could senators who had faced down Hannibal's elephants cower before a single man's madness? The answer lies not in individual weakness, but in the terrifying efficiency with which Caligula weaponized shame itself. He understood that to break a people, one need not always use force. Sometimes, forcing them to participate in their own humiliation proved far more effective. Archaeological evidence from the period reveals a city held in the grip of fear. Graffiti hastily scratched on alley walls speaks of unspeakable acts witnessed but never openly discussed. Official records, normally meticulous in their detail, become curiously vague when describing certain palace ceremonies. It's as if the very act of recording these events was too dangerous, the truth too terrible to commit to permanent record. Yet fragments survive, preserved by accident or hidden by brave souls who believed future generations needed to know what transpired. Modern historians approach this period with a mixture of fascination and horror. The challenge lies in separating fact from propaganda, as many accounts were written after Caligula's assassination by those eager to justify his murder. Yet when multiple independent sources corroborate the same horrific details, when archaeological evidence supports written testimony, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes history's monsters are not exaggerations, but understatements of reality. The question that haunts us across the centuries is not whether these events occurred, but how they were allowed to continue. Rome was not a helpless city. It was the center of an empire with legions at its command. Yet for 4 years, from 37 to 41 CE, the most powerful men in the known world submitted to degradations that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. This speaks to something deeper than mere fear of death. It reveals how systematic abuse can paralyze entire societies. As we delve into this dark chapter of human history, we must remember that we examine it not for sensationalism, but for understanding. The victims of Caligula's reign were real people with real families, whose suffering echoes across 2 millennia. Their stories deserve to be told with both honesty and respect, acknowledging the full horror of what occurred while never losing sight of their humanity. This documentary will trace the descent from hope to horror, examining how absolute power corrupted absolutely and transformed a promising young ruler into history's most notorious sexual predator. We will explore not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, and what lessons this terrible period holds for modern society. For in understanding how civilizations can fail to protect their most vulnerable, we better equip ourselves to prevent such failures in our own time. The story that follows is not easy to tell or hear. It contains accounts of systematic sexual abuse, forced incest, and the complete breakdown of moral boundaries that Roman society held sacred. Yet it is precisely because these events are so disturbing that they must be examined. History's darkest chapters often contain its most important lessons, and the reign of Caligula stands as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked power and societal complicity in evil. To understand the horror that was to come, we must first understand the hope that preceded it. When Caligula ascended to the throne on March 18, 37 CE, Rome erupted in celebration. The son of the beloved general Germanicus, raised among the legions who gave him his nickname Little Boots, represented everything Romans hoped for in a leader. Young, charismatic, and seemingly devoted to the welfare of his people, he appeared to be the antidote to the paranoid final years of his predecessor, Tiberius. The early months of his reign seemed to confirm these hopes. Caligula recalled political exiles, burned the secret files Tiberius had compiled on prominent citizens, and distributed generous bonuses to the military. He reduced some taxes and staged magnificent games that delighted the populace. Contemporary accounts describe a leader who walked among his people, who listened to their concerns, who seemed genuinely interested in being a different kind of emperor than those who came before. Yet even in these halcyon days, there were signs that all was not well. Caligula's devotion to his sisters, particularly Drusilla, exceeded the bounds of normal sibling affection. He insisted they be granted honors typically reserved for the emperor himself, and his public displays of affection made even jaded Roman courtiers uncomfortable. When foreign ambassadors arrived, he would parade his sisters before them like prized possessions, his hands lingering too long on their shoulders, his gaze too intense. The transformation began in October of 37 CE, when Caligula fell gravely ill. For weeks, the empire held its breath as their young emperor hovered between life and death. Prayers were offered in every temple, and some citizens even vowed to sacrifice their own lives if the gods would spare their ruler. When Caligula finally recovered, Rome rejoiced, but the man who emerged from that sickbed was fundamentally changed from the one who had entered it. Ancient sources differ on what exactly transpired during those fevered weeks. Some speak of brain inflammation that permanently altered his personality. Others whisper of visions and voices that convinced him of his own divinity. Philo of Alexandria, who met Caligula after his recovery, described eyes that burned with an unnatural fire and mannerisms that oscillated between manic energy and terrifying stillness. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The hope of Rome had become its nightmare. The first signs of sexual deviance emerged gradually. Palace servants began to whisper of strange nocturnal gatherings where the emperor would demand increasingly bizarre entertainments. Young slaves of both sexes would disappear into his private chambers, emerging hours later with vacant stares and marks that spoke of unspeakable violations. When concerned advisors attempted to counsel moderation, Caligula would fly into rages that left even hardened soldiers trembling. As his condition deteriorated, so too did his restraint. What had begun as private indulgences soon spilled into public view. Dinner parties became orgies where attendance was mandatory for Rome's elite. Senators were forced to watch as their wives and daughters were subjected to the emperor's attentions, knowing that any sign of displeasure could result in their entire family's destruction. The social fabric of Roman society, built on concepts of honor and dignity, began to unravel thread by thread. The imperial palace itself was transformed into what one contemporary described as a brothel of unimaginable depravity. Caligula established a formal system where the wives and children of noble families could be borrowed for his pleasure. Those who refused found themselves facing trumped-up charges of treason, their estates confiscated, their families destroyed. Those who complied lived in constant fear that their submission would not be enough to save them from the emperor's capricious wrath. Perhaps most disturbing was the bureaucratic efficiency with which these horrors were administered. Palace scribes maintained detailed records of who had been summoned, what acts they had been forced to perform, and how they had responded. These documents, some of which survived the later purges, reveal a systematic approach to degradation that went far beyond mere personal gratification. Caligula was not simply indulging his desires. He was deliberately destroying the social bonds that held Roman society together. The extent of documentation speaks to something even more sinister than the acts themselves. By forcing his administrators to record these violations in the same matter-of-fact tone used for tax records or military dispatches, Caligula normalized the unthinkable. Rape became routine, incest administrative, and human dignity nothing more than an entry in a ledger. The very language of governance was corrupted to serve his twisted purposes. One of the most horrific aspects of Caligula's reign was his treatment of children. Roman society, for all its faults, generally protected the innocence of youth. Children of citizens were considered sacred, their virtue inviolate until they came of age. Caligula shattered this taboo with deliberate cruelty. He established what he called training programs, where young boys and girls would be educated in ways that would prepare them to serve in his court. The details of these programs, preserved in fragmentary accounts by horrified witnesses, reveal a systematic approach to child abuse that defies comprehension. Children as young as 7 were subjected to gradual conditioning that broke down their natural boundaries and prepared them for worse violations to come. Those who resisted faced punishments designed not just to hurt but to humiliate, often carried out in front of their parents, who were forced to watch in silence. Noble families found themselves in an impossible position. To send their children to the palace when summoned meant subjecting them to certain abuse. To refuse meant death for the entire family line. Some attempted to send their children away to distant provinces, only to find that Caligula's reach extended throughout the empire. Others tried bribing palace officials to have their children's names removed from the lists, but such attempts often backfired when the emperor learned of them. The psychological torture extended beyond the physical acts themselves. Caligula delighted in forcing parents to praise him for the honor of having their children serve in his palace. Fathers who had commanded legions were reduced to tears as they thanked the emperor for violating their daughters. Mothers who had raised their sons to embody Roman virtues watched helplessly as those same sons were feminized and paraded as the emperor's playthings. This systematic destruction of familial bonds served a calculated purpose. By forcing families to participate in their own degradation, Caligula created a web of shared shame that prevented organized resistance. How could senators conspire against him when each knew the others had submitted to the same humiliations? How could they face each other in the forum when they had all witnessed each other's complete debasement? The documentation of these crimes, preserved despite later attempts to destroy all records of Caligula's reign, provides us with insights into both the methodology of systematic abuse and the psychology of those who perpetrate it. Palace records show that Caligula kept detailed notes on which degradations produced the strongest reactions in his victims. He studied shame like a scientist, experimenting with different combinations of public and private humiliation to achieve maximum psychological impact. One particularly chilling document discovered in the ruins of a villa outside Rome contains what appears to be Caligula's personal notes on breaking prominent citizens. Written in his own hand, These notes reveal a mind that viewed human suffering not as an unfortunate consequence of his desires, but as the primary goal. He categorized his victims by their resistance levels, noting which techniques worked best on different personality types. The emperor's obsession with his sisters, particularly Julia Drusilla, represented perhaps the most public and shocking of his sexual transgressions. In a society where incest was considered among the gravest of sins, Caligula not only engaged in sexual relationships with all three of his sisters, but flaunted these relationships before the Senate and people of Rome. He appeared with them at public functions as if they were his wives, demanding that they receive the same honors and recognition. When Drusilla died in June of 38 CE, Caligula's grief took forms that shocked even those already accustomed to his excesses. He declared her a goddess, establishing mandatory worship throughout the empire. Anyone who failed to properly mourn her death faced execution. He forced the Senate to swear oaths by her divinity and established a formal priesthood dedicated to her worship. In death, she became a tool for even greater degradation of Roman religious traditions. The relationship with his surviving sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, grew even more twisted after Drusilla's death. He would force them to participate in elaborate ceremonies where they would reenact scenes with him that he claimed to have shared with Drusilla. These performances, conducted before audiences of terrified nobles, served both to satisfy his perversions and to demonstrate his complete power over even the most fundamental taboos of society. The corruption of religious practices became another avenue for Caligula's sexual depravities. He declared himself a living god and demanded worship in temples throughout the empire, but this worship took forms that horrified traditional Romans. Temple prostitution, unknown in Roman religion, was introduced as a form of devotion to the divine emperor. Vestal virgins, whose chastity was considered essential to Rome's prosperity, were subjected to the emperor's advances, destroying a tradition that had endured for centuries. Caligula's sexual practices extended beyond mere personal gratification to become tools of political control. He would force senators to offer their wives to him as proof of loyalty, then use these encounters to blackmail them into supporting his increasingly erratic policies. Those who refused found their wives accused of adultery, a charge that carried severe penalties under Roman law. The bitter irony was not lost on anyone. The emperor, who violated every marriage in Rome, used the sanctity of marriage as a weapon against those who opposed him. The establishment of what Caligula called his pleasure fleet represented another innovation in institutionalized depravity. He commissioned a series of massive floating platforms on the Bay of Naples, equipped with every conceivable apparatus for sexual gratification. These floating palaces became the sites of orgies that lasted for days, where the boundary between participant and victim completely dissolved. Attendance was mandatory for those summoned, and the Coast Guard was instructed to prevent anyone from leaving until the emperor gave permission. The economic impact of Caligula's sexual excesses cannot be overlooked. The resources devoted to satisfying his desires drained the imperial treasury at an alarming rate. Exotic slaves trained in specific sexual techniques commanded prices that would have funded entire military campaigns. The construction of specialized furniture and devices for his pleasure chambers employed hundreds of craftsmen who might otherwise have been building infrastructure for the empire. Rome's wealth was literally being consumed by its emperor's insatiable appetites. Beyond the direct financial costs, the corruption of Rome's administrative systems created inefficiencies that would plague the empire for generations. Officials who should have been governing provinces were instead managing the emperor's sexual calendar. Military officers who should have been defending frontiers found themselves procuring victims for imperial orgies. The machinery of empire, built over centuries of disciplined expansion, was being retrofitted to serve one man's perversions. The international ramifications of Caligula's behavior extended far beyond Rome's borders. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their rulers about the shocking scenes they witnessed at the imperial court. Some kingdoms began to question whether alliance with Rome was worth the risk of exposing their own nobles to such degradation. Others saw opportunity in Rome's distraction, planning invasions and rebellions while the emperor was occupied with his pleasures. One particularly damaging incident involved the delegation from Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. The ambassadors were subjected to a dinner where Caligula forced Roman matrons to serve naked and perform sexual acts with slaves for entertainment. When the shocked Parthians protested this breach of diplomatic protocol, Caligula threatened to have them castrated and sent back as a gift to their king. The incident nearly provoked a war that Rome, in its distracted state, was ill-prepared to fight. The treatment of Rome's provincial subjects under Caligula's rule reflected the same patterns of sexual exploitation seen in the capital. Governors appointed by the emperor understood that their positions depended on facilitating his desires when he traveled. They would round up the most attractive young people in their provinces as tribute for imperial visits. Those who failed to provide sufficiently pleasing offerings found themselves recalled and executed for imagined crimes. In one documented case from Syria, an entire village was depopulated of its youth when Caligula announced a planned visit. Parents who tried to hide their children were crucified along the roads as a warning to others. The governor, eager to curry favor, established collection points where families were required to present their children for inspection. Those selected were taken to special camps where they were prepared for the emperor's arrival. Many never returned. The military, traditionally the most disciplined element of Roman society, was not immune to Caligula's corrupting influence. He would visit legionary camps and demand that the soldiers provide him with their youngest and most attractive recruits. Military discipline based on strict hierarchies and mutual respect broke down when soldiers saw their officers pimping out their own men to maintain the emperor's favor. Some units experienced near mutinies as soldiers refused to subject their comrades to such treatment. The Praetorian Guard, responsible for the emperor's safety, found themselves in the most compromised position of all. These elite soldiers were forced to stand watch while their emperor engaged in acts that violated every code they had sworn to uphold. Some guards later reported that the hardest part of their service was not facing death in battle, but maintaining their composure while witnessing the systematic degradation of Roman citizens they were supposed to protect. The psychological impact on those forced to participate in or witness Caligula's excesses created a traumatized generation. Physicians of the period reported unprecedented levels of what they called melancholia among the noble classes. Suicide rates soared as individuals chose death over continued humiliation. Some entire families took poison together rather than submit to another summons to the palace. The social fabric of Rome was not merely strained, it was being systematically shredded. Women, in particular, faced impossible choices under Caligula's reign. Roman matrons who had been raised to embody virtue and dignity found themselves reduced to sexual objects for the emperor's amusement. Those who tried to maintain their honor faced not only personal consequences, but the destruction of their families. Many developed elaborate strategies to avoid attracting attention, deliberately disfiguring themselves or feigning illness to escape notice. The few women who found themselves in positions of relative safety, often those who had already been thoroughly degraded and thus held no further interest for the emperor, formed secret networks to protect others. They would warn families when their names appeared on palace lists, help young women escape the city, and provide refuge for those who had survived palace ordeals. These networks, operating in constant fear of discovery, represented one of the few points of light in an otherwise dark period. Children who survived Caligula's training programs carried psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. Many were unable to form normal relationships as adults, their capacity for trust and intimacy permanently damaged. Some became abusers themselves, perpetuating cycles of violence that would echo through generations. Others retreated entirely from society, living as hermits rather than risk human connection that might trigger traumatic memories. The medical professionals of the era, limited in their understanding of psychological trauma, nonetheless documented symptoms that modern readers would recognize as severe PTSD. Accounts speak of victims who could not sleep without nightmares, who flew into panics at unexpected touches, who dissociated from their bodies during intimate moments. The emperor had created a generation of broken souls whose suffering extended far beyond his reign. Religious leaders faced their own crisis of faith as they watched their sacred institutions corrupted. Priests who had devoted their lives to serving the gods were forced to participate in ceremonies that mocked everything they held holy. Some chose martyrdom rather than compliance, but most, faced with the threat of their entire congregations being massacred, reluctantly participated while privately maintaining their true beliefs. The corruption of religious practice had lasting consequences for Roman spirituality. Many citizens lost faith in gods who would allow such sacrilege to occur unpunished. Others turned to foreign mystery cults that promised salvation from the horrors of earthly existence. The traditional Roman religion, already under pressure from imported beliefs, suffered wounds from which it would never fully recover. The artistic community, traditionally celebrants of beauty and virtue, found themselves conscripted into documenting and enabling depravity. Sculptors were commissioned to create obscene statues for the palace pleasure rooms. Painters were forced to decorate walls with scenes that glorified the emperor's perversions. Poets who had once composed odes to honor and courage now wrote verses praising activities that made them physically ill to contemplate. Some artists attempted to embed subtle criticisms or symbols of resistance in their works, but such efforts were dangerous. Caligula, for all his madness, possessed a cunning ability to detect mockery or disapproval. Artists who were suspected of subversion faced creative punishments that turned their own tools against them. Sculptors had their hands crushed, painters their eyes put out, poets their tongues removed. The message was clear: art would serve power, or art would be destroyed. The economic systems of patronage that had sustained Roman intellectual life for centuries collapsed under the weight of Caligula's demands. Wealthy patrons, who might have supported philosophers or historians instead, spent their resources trying to buy safety for their families. Libraries went unfunded as their benefactors fled Rome or fell victim to purges. The intellectual flowering that had characterized the early empire withered in the toxic atmosphere of fear and degradation. Education itself became a casualty of the emperor's reign. Parents who would normally have sent their children to study with renowned teachers instead kept them hidden at home. Schools closed as teachers fled rather than risk attracting imperial attention. An entire generation grew up with limited access to learning, creating intellectual deficits that would handicap Rome for decades to come. The breakdown of the legal system under Caligula represented another form of systematic abuse. Laws meant to protect citizens became weapons in the emperor's hands. The charge of maiestas, treason, was expanded to cover any action that displeased him, including refusing sexual advances. Judges who tried to maintain legal standards found themselves on trial. The entire concept of justice became meaningless when the highest authority in the land recognized no authority but his own desires. Legal documents from the period reveal the grotesque parody that trials became. Prosecutors would argue that refusing to prostitute one's wife to the emperor constituted treason against his divine person. Defense attorneys, knowing that actual defense was impossible, would instead compete to see who could most eloquently praise the emperor's wisdom in detecting such subtle forms of disloyalty. The accused often confessed to imaginary crimes rather than risk the real ones being exposed. The impact on provincial governance was equally severe. Governors who had been selected for their administrative abilities were replaced by those willing to facilitate the emperor's desires. Competent officials who refused to participate in the systematic abuse were recalled and executed, while sycophants and enablers rose to positions of power. The efficient administration that had been Rome's greatest strength deteriorated into a network of corrupt officials whose primary concern was avoiding imperial displeasure. Trade and commerce suffered as merchants became reluctant to bring their families to Rome. The great markets that had made the capital the economic heart of the Mediterranean world saw decreased activity as traders conducted only essential business before fleeing. The free flow of goods and ideas that had enriched the empire slowed to a trickle, creating shortages and economic disruptions that affected citizens at every level of society. The corruption even reached into the food supply systems that kept Rome's massive population fed. Officials responsible for grain distribution found themselves spending more time procuring victims for the emperor than ensuring adequate supplies. When shortages occurred, instead of addressing the systemic problems, Caligula would execute the officials and appoint new ones who were even less competent but more compliant. The result was periodic famines that added physical suffering to the psychological trauma already afflicting the population. Public works, the grand construction projects that had been a hallmark of Roman civilization, ground to a halt. Resources that should have gone to aqueducts and roads instead funded the emperor's pleasure barges and palace renovations. Engineers and architects found themselves designing torture devices and sex dungeons rather than the infrastructure improvements the empire desperately needed. The physical decay of Rome's buildings became a visible symbol of its moral collapse. The final phase of Caligula's reign saw an escalation of horrors that pushed even his most reluctant opponents toward action. No longer content with private depravities, he began staging public spectacles that combined sex and violence in ways that traumatized entire audiences. The arena, already a place of death, became a theater for acts that made hardened gladiators weep. Citizens were forced to attend these displays, with absence noted and punished as severely as any other form of resistance. One particularly horrific innovation was what Caligula called educational performances, where children were forced to watch sexual acts before being made to participate themselves. Parents who tried to cover their children's eyes or remove them from the arena faced immediate execution. The psychological warfare was deliberate and calculated. By forcing families to witness each other's degradation, he created trauma bonds that would persist long after his death. The tipping point came when Caligula announced plans to move the capital to Alexandria, where he believed he would be properly worshipped as the god he claimed to be. This would have meant abandoning Rome to chaos, while he established an even more elaborate court dedicated entirely to his pleasures. The prospect of the empire fragmenting while its emperor pursued ever greater depravities finally motivated those with the power to act. The conspiracy that ultimately ended Caligula's life on January 24, 41 CE, included members of the Praetorian Guard, senators, and palace officials who had endured years of humiliation. The fact that these groups, traditionally at odds with each other, could unite speaks to the universal recognition that the situation had become intolerable. Even those who had profited from the corruption understood that continuation meant the complete collapse of Roman society. The assassination itself was brutal and swift. Caligula was stabbed 30 times by conspirators who wanted to ensure he could not survive, as Caesar had briefly survived his assassination. Some of the wounds were clearly personal, aimed at the genitals that had been the instruments of so much suffering. His wife and infant daughter were also killed, a harsh decision driven by the fear that any survivors might serve as rallying points for those who had been corrupted by the regime. The immediate aftermath of Caligula's death saw an explosion of long-suppressed rage. Statues of the emperor were torn down and smashed. His writings were burned. The Senate attempted to declare damnatio memoriae, the complete erasure of his memory from official records. But the trauma he had inflicted could not be so easily erased. The victims of his abuse did not suddenly recover with his death. The institutions he had corrupted did not immediately regain their integrity. The succession of Claudius, Caligula's uncle, brought a desperate attempt to restore normalcy to Rome. But the new emperor faced the challenge of governing a traumatized population with corrupted institutions. Many of those who had enabled Caligula's excesses remained in positions of power, protected by the mutual blackmail of shared complicity. Claudius had to balance the need for stability with the demands for justice, often choosing the former at the expense of the latter. Efforts to provide support for Caligula's victims were limited by Roman society's inability to acknowledge what had occurred. There was no framework for dealing with mass sexual trauma, no understanding of how to help children who had been systematically abused. Many victims found themselves further marginalized, tainted by their association with the former regime, even though they had been unwilling participants. The shame that Caligula had weaponized continued to silence those who most needed help. The economic recovery from Caligula's reign took years. The treasury had been drained by his excesses, requiring new taxes that further burdened a population already suffering. Trade slowly resumed as confidence in Roman stability was rebuilt. But some damage was permanent. Intellectual and artistic communities that had been scattered did not simply reconstitute themselves. The brain drain, caused by emigration of talented individuals fleeing the regime, left gaps that took generations to fill. Religious reform attempted to cleanse the temples of their corruption, but the taint lingered. Many Romans had lost faith in gods who had permitted such sacrilege. The rise of foreign cults accelerated as people sought spiritual comfort outside traditional structures. This religious fragmentation would eventually contribute to the acceptance of Christianity, which offered a moral framework completely separate from the corrupted state religion. The historical record of Caligula's reign posed challenges for Roman historians. How could they accurately document what had occurred without seeming to glorify or sensationalize it? How much detail was necessary to convey the full horror without creating a manual for future tyrants? Writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio struggled with these questions, often resorting to euphemism or claiming that full details were too terrible to record. Modern historians face similar challenges. The need to understand how systematic sexual abuse can be weaponized by authoritarian regimes requires honest examination of historical examples. Yet there is always the risk that such examination might be misused or might further traumatize descendants of victims. The balance between historical accuracy and sensitivity remains delicate, requiring careful consideration of how these stories are told and to what purpose. The lessons of Caligula's reign extend far beyond ancient Rome. His systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of political control has parallels in more recent history. The way he corrupted institutions meant to protect citizens, the exploitation of shame to prevent resistance, the targeting of children to break down social cohesion. These tactics have been employed by authoritarian regimes throughout history. Understanding how they work is essential to preventing their repetition. The complicity of enablers in Caligula's system also provides important insights. Many who facilitated his crimes were not themselves sadists, but rather individuals trying to protect their families or maintain their positions. The gradual normalization of the unthinkable, the small compromises that led to complete moral collapse, demonstrate how ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary evil. This uncomfortable truth remains relevant to modern discussions of institutional abuse. The role of documentation in both perpetrating and exposing systematic abuse deserves particular attention. Caligula's meticulous records served to bureaucratize horror, making it seem official and therefore somehow legitimate. Yet these same records became evidence of his crimes, preserving the truth even when there were efforts to suppress it. The tension between documentation as a tool of oppression and as a means of bearing witness continues in contemporary human rights work. The intergenerational trauma caused by Caligula's reign had effects that rippled through Roman society for decades. Children who witnessed or experienced abuse grew up to be adults who struggled with trust, intimacy, and authority. Some perpetuated cycles of abuse, while others devoted themselves to preventing such horrors from recurring. The varied responses to trauma remind us that there is no single path to healing, either for individuals or societies. The question of justice in the aftermath of systematic abuse remains complicated. Many of Caligula's enablers escaped punishment, protected by the need for stability or by mutual complicity. Victims often found that seeking justice meant reliving trauma in public forums that were not equipped to handle their experiences. The inadequacy of traditional justice systems to address mass trauma continues to challenge societies recovering from periods of systematic abuse. The psychological profiles that emerge from studying Caligula and his inner circle provide insights into how sexual predators operate when given unlimited power. The escalation of behaviors, the need for ever greater stimulation, the use of humiliation as a form of control, these patterns appear consistently across cultures and time periods. Understanding these patterns is crucial for identifying and preventing such individuals from gaining power. The resistance strategies employed by those who opposed Caligula, though often unsuccessful, demonstrate the importance of maintaining moral clarity even in hopeless situations. Secret networks that protected potential victims, artists who embedded subtle criticisms in their work, officials who quietly sabotaged the worst excesses. These acts of courage, however small, preserved some vestige of humanity during inhuman times. They remind us that resistance is possible even under the most oppressive conditions. The role of bystanders in Caligula's system raises uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility. Many Romans who neither participated in nor directly suffered from the emperor's excesses nonetheless benefited from their proximity to power. Their silence, whether motivated by fear or advantage, enabled the continuation of abuse. This dynamic, repeated throughout history, challenges us to consider our own obligations when witnessing injustice. The collapse of social trust caused by Caligula's reign had long-lasting effects on Roman society. When families could be forced to participate in their own degradation, when friends could become informants, when protectors became predators, the basic bonds that hold communities together dissolved. Rebuilding these bonds required not just time, but active efforts to create new frameworks for trust and mutual support. The international implications of Rome's internal corruption during this period shaped diplomatic relationships for generations. Foreign powers who had witnessed Rome's degradation were both emboldened to challenge its authority and cautious about too close association with its culture. The reputation for depravity that attached itself to Rome during Caligula's reign influenced how the empire was perceived long after reforms had been implemented. The medical and psychological understanding of trauma in ancient Rome was limited, but physicians of the period documented symptoms and attempted treatments that provide insights into both the scale of suffering and the human capacity for resilience. Their records speak of patients who found healing through religious practice, philosophical study, or simply the passage of time. While their methods were primitive by modern standards, their compassion and dedication to healing remind us of the importance of caring for trauma survivors. The literary and artistic works produced in the aftermath of Caligula's reign reflect a society grappling with how to process collective trauma. Poets wrote obliquely of wounds that could not be directly named. Playwrights created allegories that allowed audiences to confront their experiences at a safe remove. Artists developed new visual languages to express emotions for which there were no adequate words. This cultural processing of trauma played an essential role in Rome's eventual recovery. The reforms implemented by Claudius and subsequent emperors to prevent another Caligula reveal both the lessons learned and the limitations of institutional safeguards. New checks on imperial power, reforms to the Praetorian Guard, and attempts to restore Senate authority all aimed to prevent the concentration of unchecked power in one individual. Yet the fundamental structure of imperial rule remained, creating ongoing tensions between the need for strong leadership and the fear of tyranny. The way memory of Caligula's reign was managed, what was preserved, what was suppressed, what was transformed, provides insights into how societies deal with traumatic histories. The tension between the need to remember, to prevent repetition, and the desire to forget, to heal and move forward, created competing narratives that historians still struggle to reconcile. This challenge of managing traumatic memory remains relevant to modern societies dealing with their own dark chapters. As we conclude this examination of one of history's darkest chapters, we must grapple with the question of why such stories need to be told. The horrors inflicted during Caligula's reign are not easy to contemplate, and there is always the risk that focusing on such depravity might itself be a form of exploitation. Yet silence about systematic abuse serves only those who would perpetrate it. By understanding how power can be twisted into an instrument of mass trauma, we better equip ourselves to recognize and resist such corruption in our own time. The victims of Caligula's reign were not statistics, but human beings whose suffering demands acknowledgement. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people who loved and were loved, who had hopes and dreams that were crushed beneath the weight of imperial madness. Their stories, painful as they are to hear, remind us of the preciousness of human dignity and the terrible consequences when that dignity is systematically violated. The complicity of Roman institutions in enabling Caligula's crimes serves as a warning about the fragility of civilizational constraints. Laws, customs, and moral codes that had developed over centuries proved insufficient when challenged by determined depravity backed by absolute power. This recognition should humble us about our own institutions and motivate constant vigilance against their corruption. The recovery of Roman society from Caligula's reign, imperfect and incomplete as it was, nonetheless demonstrates human resilience. Communities that had been shattered slowly rebuilt. Individuals who had been broken found ways to continue living. New generations grew up determined to create a better world than the one they inherited. This resilience, hard-won and often partial, represents perhaps the most important lesson from this dark period. The echoes of Caligula's reign can be heard throughout subsequent history. Whenever power is concentrated without accountability, whenever shame is weaponized for control, whenever the vulnerable are systematically abused, we see variations on themes first fully explored during those terrible 4 years. Recognition of these patterns is the first step toward preventing their repetition. In studying Caligula's sexual atrocities, we confront fundamental questions about human nature. How could a young man who showed such promise become a monster? What combination of mental illness, unlimited power, and societal enabling created conditions for such systematic evil? While we may never fully answer these questions, wrestling with them helps us understand both the depths of human depravity and the conditions that allow it to flourish. The responsibility of those who survived Caligula's reign to bear witness created a tension between personal healing and public duty. Many victims wanted nothing more than to forget their experiences and rebuild their lives in privacy. Yet some recognized that silence would only enable future atrocities and chose to speak, despite the personal cost. Their courage in bearing witness across 2 millennia allows us to learn from their suffering. The judgment of history on Caligula is unanimous in its condemnation, Yet the details of his crimes were nearly lost to efforts at suppression and the passage of time. That we can still study this period owes much to those who risked their lives to preserve records, who hid documents from destruction, who passed down oral histories despite the danger. Their determination that truth should survive reminds us of our own obligations to historical memory. The transformation of trauma into wisdom is never guaranteed and always incomplete. Many who suffered under Caligula carried wounds that never healed. But some found ways to transform their experiences into teachings that could protect future generations. The philosophical and ethical developments that emerged from this period's suffering represent attempts to build meaning from meaninglessness, to create protection against future violations. As modern readers, we approach this history with both advantages and limitations. We have psychological frameworks for understanding trauma that the Romans lacked. We have witnessed enough historical repetitions to recognize patterns they could not see, yet we also risk imposing our own interpretations on experiences we can never fully comprehend. The challenge is to learn what we can, while respecting the ultimate unknowability of others' suffering. The legacy of Caligula's reign extends beyond the specific acts he committed to the broader questions it raises about power, complicity, and resistance. Every generation must grapple with these questions anew, as the forms of abuse may change, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. By studying the past, honestly, however painful, we better prepare ourselves to confront these challenges in our own time. The courage required to examine such dark history should not be underestimated. It is far easier to look away, to focus on more pleasant aspects of the past, to tell ourselves that such extremes could never happen again. But comfort built on ignorance is false comfort. True security comes from understanding how civilizations can fail and working actively to prevent such failures. In the end, the story of Caligula's sexual atrocities is not just about one mad emperor, but about the systems that enabled him, the people who suffered under him, and the society that eventually found the strength to stop him. It is a story about the worst of human nature, but also about the resilience that allows us to survive and eventually transcend such horrors. May we learn its lessons well, that such suffering need never be repeated. The historical record closes with Caligula's death, but the questions his reign raises remain eternally relevant. How do we build societies strong enough to resist tyranny, yet flexible enough to adapt? How do we protect the vulnerable while maintaining freedom? How do we remember trauma without being paralyzed by it? These challenges, first faced by Romans 2,000 years ago, continue to define the human struggle for dignity and justice. As we step back from this dark chapter of history, we carry with us not just knowledge of horrors, but also appreciation for those who resisted, survived, and eventually rebuilt. Their example reminds us that even in the darkest times, human dignity can endure. The light may be reduced to the faintest flicker, but it need never be fully extinguished. In honoring their memory and learning from their suffering, we commit ourselves to being guardians of that light for future generations.